Thank you very much. First of all, I'd just like to thank everyone for inviting me, for the University of Montenegro, for Jovan, for persuading me to come to Montenegro. As we were discussing today, I've actually been rather fascinated by Montenegro for a long time. 20 years ago, I was a professor at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and I had a colleague in anthropology. I was in the economics department, but I had a colleague in the anthropology department called Christopher Bohm. And Christopher's PhD dissertation from the early 1960s was actually on Montenegro, and he studied historical patterns of feuding amongst clans in the Montenegrin mountains. Mostly retrospective evidence from the 1930s and 1940s, but it's an absolutely fascinating book, like for me, kind of intellectually, because one of the things that I've worked on for many years are the variation in the world in state structures and kind of the desire to build a state or the opposition to build a state, and in what circumstances effective state institutions emerge and consolidate themselves. You see this huge variation in the world in that. So Montenegro, for me, was a sort of fascinating example in the sense that, it shared so much history with the rest of Europe, part of the Roman Empire, whatever, Abrahamic religions, many things which other parts of the world don't have in common, yet there was still this kind of antagonism towards the creation of a centralized state. So that's why I found the Montenegrin example so interesting. That's why it ended up in our book, The Narrow Corridor, and that's why I'm so sort of thrilled to be here in person. The only real question is why I didn't get here earlier, and that's because I'm just spread too thin. And most of my real research has been for many, many years in Latin America and in sub-Saharan Africa, and there's only so many days in the year, unfortunately. But anyway, the translation, which I'm very honored and very excited to see, gives me a great pretext for coming here. So I just trying to give you a kind of sense of how thrilled I am and how fascinated I am to learn more about your amazing country and its history and its society. And I started life as an economist, and I won the Nobel Prize in economics, ironically enough. It's ironic. I say ironically because when you learn economics, and when I did my PhD dissertation, I was working in kind of mathematical economics and general equilibrium theory and in game theory. And when you study economic theory like that, everywhere is the same. Everywhere in the world is the same. Everyone in the world has the same utility functions and production functions and markets. And economic theory is sort of projected to be something like Newton's laws of gravitational motion, that force is equal to mass times acceleration, whether you're in Montenegro or Mongolia, or Bolivia, or force is equal to mass times acceleration. But I guess what I've come to understand myself is that social theory is not actually like that. Social theory is much more conditional on the culture and the history and the sociology of different societies. And for many years, I just sort of tried to ignore that and bury it. And then at some point, I completely changed and decided I should embrace it. It makes your life much more difficult, but it's so interesting. Humans have created such different societies in different parts of the world. And it's just fascinating to study that and to learn about it. And it's complicated to understand, but that's just how things are. For me, that's my own conclusion at this point in my career. Last 6 years, I've been working a lot in eastern Nigeria, which I claim is like the most diverse place I've ever set foot in on the planet. And Igbo is the main language spoken in eastern Nigeria, and there's an Igbo proverb that I like very much, which is the okwo. So the okwo, it's a type of it's like a guinea fowl, it's like a type of bird. The okwo sings differently in every village. you know. So the bird may look the same, but its song is different in every village. So it's a metaphor for every Nigerian village is different from the one next door. Politics are different. The social system is different. Anyway, so I digress. Okay, so my task today is to talk about the narrow corridor, which has been so fantastically translated, and I haven't talked about this book for a while, actually. So it's always forward in academia. It's always the next project and the next project and the next project. My wife is always very critical of this. She says, the problem with academia is you never get to sort of sit and relax and kind of enjoy what you've achieved. As soon as you finish something, it's like the next project, or we have to finish that, and we have to. So this is a nice moment maybe where at least I don't know that I achieved anything, but we did write this big book. So let me try to kind of enjoy the fact that we're proud of the book, and we spent a long time researching it. Okay, so what's the book about? So, of course, a lot of our work as economists, Professor Acemoglu and I, has been about comparative economic development. But one of the things that we talked about, and we thought about a lot when we were writing this book, is could we kind of broaden the agenda in some sense? Or instead of just thinking of the dependent variable or the outcome as being prosperity or economic material benefits or living standards or something, there's many other things about a society that we care about, okay? And I think both of us would say liberty is one of those things, okay? So we wanted to kind of broaden the discussion. I'm not sure we succeeded, but we wanted to broaden the discussion in terms of what kind of outcomes do we really care about achieving in society. Yes, we care about economics and prosperity and eradicating poverty, and we care about inequality and social mobility, but we care about things which are less easy to measure, with a dollar sign in front of them or a euro sign in front of them. And, we put the word liberty on that. Okay, so I could talk about the book in different ways, but I thought I'd have a go at talking about it like this, okay? And I'm going to start by quoting, John Locke, and I do that for a reason, which is that, I think Professor Acemoglu and our next book, which we hope doesn't exist, it's sort of a fantasy at the moment, but I'll look forward to the Montenegrin, coming back for the launch of the Montenegrin translation of our not written next book, is going to be paying a lot more attention to ideas and ideology. So it's good to have John Locke up there to start with. So John Locke has a famous definition of liberty. This comes right at the start of his second treatise of government, and he defines liberty as a state of perfect freedom. Humans want to, so here's the claim. There's two claims on this slide. The first claim is humans want to live in liberty, by which John Locke meant a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, without asking leave or depending upon the will of any other man. Okay? So you could think of this as being a definition of, so-called negative liberty. Okay? So, and it's a kind of claim here, there's a claim here that people aspire to live in such a state, okay, where they can make decisions about themselves or their persons as they like without asking anybody else, is it okay if I do that? All right. So there's John Locke's definition of liberty. So I think it's pretty clear that, if that's your definition of liberty, and if that's what people are aspiring to, that's a kind of empirical claim, we could debate that. It's pretty obvious there's a huge amount of variation in the world in the extent to which people experience liberty of this sort, okay? So one way of thinking about the development of the theoretical framework in the book is to sort of say here's a definition of liberty. Let's imagine that everybody aspires to live in liberty, which might not be true. There's a lot of variation in the world in the extent to which people have this sort of liberty. And we want to develop a theory to try to understand that variation. That's the motivation of the book, okay? So to sort of see what that theory looks like, let me talk about this variation in the extent of liberty at some kind of intuitive level and try to think about what seems to be associated with liberty or illiberty, all right? And the most obvious source of illiberty, and this is certainly, what John Locke was thinking about, the second treatise of government, which was written in the 1680s, probably in the early 1680s, but became the kind of intellectual foundation for the so-called Glorious Revolution in Britain in 1688, which kind of derailed this attempt to create an absolutist monarchy in Britain and sort of institutionalized the sovereignty of Parliament. So that was a very important moment of political transition in Britain. That's, Locke was thinking about liberty, and he was thinking about particular threats to liberty. And the idea he had in mind was that liberty seems very difficult to have in a situation where you have a very powerful state dominating society, okay? So what's an example of that? Well, an obvious example of that today would be China, okay? So, in the 1940s, it might be just a coincidence, but I recently reread 1984 by George Orwell. I don't know why anyone living in the United States at the moment would want to reread George Orwell's 1984, but anyway, it just happened. I'll talk to my psychoanalyst. So, of course, in 1984, Orwell talks about Big Brother is watching you. Okay, Big Brother is the dictator. Big Brother is watching you. Okay, of course, in 1948, when Orwell published that book, it wasn't technologically possible for Big Brother to watch you, but now it is. Okay, so if you go to China, there's millions and millions of these face recognition cameras on every street corner. This is, of course, in Tiananmen Square. There's Chairman Mao in the background with these face recognition cameras watching you. So Big Brother really is watching you in China, okay? So I think this is a pretty reasonable example of a situation where the state dominates society, and that dominance seems to be associated with illiberty, okay? People don't have those abilities, that negative liberty that John Locke was talking about in China, because they always have to worry about what would the Communist Party think about that, okay? Okay, great. That's what John Locke was thinking about. But I think if you think about the variation in the world, it's also pretty clear that that's not the only source of illiberty in the world, okay? That's not the whole story. That Locke, he was writing in a particular time, in a particular kind of historical and political moment. He was fixated on this one problem, okay? But if you think about the world today or historically, it's clear there's other sources of illiberty. And in fact, you have societies, which are almost the opposite of the Chinese case, where it's not the case that the states dominate society. You could almost say it's the other way round, okay? Here's an example, not Montenegro historically. I could have put it in there. It's coming later. But Yemen, okay? So the example of Yemen is sort of fabulous. This is mountainous Yemen. You can see all these boys here. These are like young men, boys. They all have a dagger in their belt. When you come of age in Yemen, you get given a dagger. There's different sorts of daggers. As you move along in life, you get different sorts of daggers and weapons. So northern Yemen in particular, the highlands of northern Yemen, historically never had a centralized state that was organized around kinship groups, clans, lineages, etc. There was never a central state. There was nothing like the Chinese state or the absolutist state that was being tried, which was kind of in the process of construction in the 1680s in Britain when Locke wrote the Second Treatise of Government. There's never been anything like that in Yemen, okay? But there's not much liberty despite the absence of a large state.